So moving along now, let's talk a little bit about iodine.
Okay, there are two iodine isotopes. One is iodine 131, which has a half-life of 8 days, meaning it lasts only for about 10 weeks before it decays away to nothing. It's a very high-energy gamma emitter, like that X-ray I talked about, and also a beta emitter, the electrons. And iodine only goes to one gland in the body, which is the thyroid gland, which sucks it up. But particularly in children, their thyroids are like a little sponge, and they suck up iodine, particularly in areas where iodine is sparse in the environment, like around Chernobyl. So they have low iodine levels, and so the thyroid particularly concentrates it. And so the iodine can change a regulatory gene in the thyroid gland in a cell and cause cancer. Now, already in Fukushima, where we've seen, I think, about 10 thyroid cancers developing in children. That's extremely rare because it took 5 years for thyroid cancers to start manifesting after Chernobyl. So this is very early. It's only 2 years, indicating to me as a pediatrician that these children got a hell of a dose of radioactive iodine, but also they got a big dose of everything else. And you know, as Arnie knows, nuclear reactors contain several hundred of these poisons. Some only last seconds, but some last millions of years. So there's a whole cocktail of radioactive elements that people will have inhaled and eaten. The other iodine is iodine 129, which has a half-life of 17 million years. So it's around forever. It's not as potently radioactive as I-131, but it's still carcinogenic, and that's around forever.
Well, we've talked a little bit about potassium iodine pills in the past and how they might be helpful to people in a nuclear accident. But how exactly do they work? My understanding is that they go to the thyroid and somehow protect the thyroid from radiation exposure.
Well, potassium iodine is just an inert substance that's not radioactive, but there's a catch. You have to take your potassium iodine tablet before the radioactive cloud reaches you, before you inhale the iodine, which is absorbed from the lung. And mostly, well, in the major accidents, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island, people didn't know about it till days after the accidents occur because the authorities don't let them know, whereby and by which time they've already inhaled radioactive iodine. That's too late. You have to take it before the cloud of radioactive iodine reaches you, and what it does is saturate the thyroid with normal iodine so the thyroid will reject, I think, 70% of the radioactive iodine, but I think 30% still gets incorporated into the thyroid. The other thing is, of course, radioactive iodine is concentrated readily in food, and particularly in milk. So children drinking milk that comes from cows or goats or sheep that have been contaminated from a reactor accident are drinking radioactive iodine. So, you know, you might have inert potassium iodide tablets in your medicine cupboard if you live near a reactor or far from a reactor, in fact, but you probably won't know in time to take the iodine anyway, and it only protects the thyroid, not totally, as I said, 70%. Not 100%, and it doesn't protect any other organs.
So clearly potassium iodine pills or tablets can help people in the event of a nuclear accident if they're dispensed quickly. However, we see during the 3 Mile Island accident and now the Fukushima accident that they were withheld. They were not dispensed quickly. Why is that?
Yes, that's right. They don't want to give it a bad name. So if the health authorities say, look, you've got to have these tablets in case there's a meltdown, everyone gets very panicked, and so you don't want to create panic. And that was the Japanese government, in fact, stated that. They didn't tell the people where the very highly radioactive cloud was moving across the country, northwest, because they didn't want to create panic. And the people evacuated right into the path of that radioactive plume. That is obscene. So the government officials, in fact, protecting and a part of the nuclear industry, they're not there to protect the people, although we elect them and we pay for them.
You know, all these isotopes indicate a couple things to me. They indicate that nuclear fuel failed, and we know that. I mean, there was a a meltdown and a melt through of the nuclear reactor vessels. But that wouldn't be enough unless the containment failed too. The containment is that last line of defense. And, that we're seeing cesium in the environment. And now we're seeing heavy isotopes like plutonium out at 20 and 30 kilometers. So when you see these transuranics, the things that are heavier than uranium out there, all these are signs of gross containment failure.
Well, let's shift gears now and talk about the one isotope that's probably been ignored more than any other by the nuclear industry, and that's tritium. Helen, can you tell us a bit about tritium?
Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Instead of being H2, it's H3. And tritium cannot be contained in anything except gold. So you can't operate a nuclear reactor without it continuously releasing into the air and the water that's used to cool it, tritium. Tritium, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny particle. And if you're enveloped, and it combines with oxygen to form tritiated water, H3O. So if you're near a reactor and there's an inversion system and there's fog, and you go outside, the fog lands on your skin, and the tritium can get right through the skin. Now, the skin lets nothing through. It's the most important organ in the body, which is why it's so serious if you get bad third-degree burns over your body. You lose your integument. Tritium gets through. Tritium also concentrates in food, and it's in the water, and it combines in the DNA molecule, which is the gene. It's incredibly carcinogenic. And although the nuclear industry poo-poos anyone who worries about it, if you look at the Journal of Health Physics, there's a huge number of articles about the toxicity of tritium, and they've been testing it on mice and rats for years and years and years. And so it induces brain tumours, muscle tumours, all sorts of cancers all over the body. And mind you, every cancer can be caused by radiation. Every cancer we describe in medicine can be induced by radiation. It also causes very gross fetal abnormalities and birth deformities. So tritium is a very, very scary element. It's used in exit signs, and of course it's leaking out of them. It's used on watch dials, and it leaks out of the watches, leaks out of everything you put it into. So, and I think the Germans did a study to look at children under the age of 5 years living within 2 miles of 16 reactors, and found that those children had a double the incidence of leukemia and a high incidence of solid cancers. And the French verified that study by doing a study of their own around their reactors. So it's very dangerous to live near a reactor, and children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults. They get cancer much more readily, and fetuses are thousands of times more so. So no women of childbearing age or children should live near a reactor. That's never talked about, and it's partly because of the tritium that it also gets into the leaves and transpires through the leaves with water that comes down at night and lands on the ground, etc. The one thing, though, we haven't talked about, Arnie, is the toxicity of plutonium, and I'd like to talk about that. Plutonium is an alpha emitter, so it's like an electron emitted from a nucleus, only it's bigger, much bigger. And if it hits a gene, bang, it usually destroys the cell, but if it doesn't, the cell is damaged, and almost certainly later you'll get cancer. So plutonium, named after Pluto, is so toxic that a millionth of a gram, if inhaled into the lung, will give you lung cancer. Each reactor makes 250 kilograms of plutonium a year. Kilograms. You need only 5 kilograms to make yourself an atomic bomb. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years, so it's around and toxic for 250,000 years. The body thinks that plutonium is iron, so it can cause lung cancer. It goes to the bone where the hemoglobin is made, where it can cause bone cancer or leukemia or multiple myeloma or other such cancers. It's stored in the liver where it can cause liver cancer. It crosses the placenta. The placenta lets nothing through to protect the fetus, but plutonium gets through because it is an iron analog where, like thalidomide, it can kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the right arm. That's called teratogenesis, damage of a genetically, chromosomally normal fetus. it also has a predilection for testicles and tends to concentrate in the testicles next to the cells that are forming the sperm, so it can produce genetic mutations in the sperm to induce genetic diseases passed on generation to generation for the rest of time. And there are 2,600 genetic diseases now described, like diabetes and cystic fibrosis and haemophilia and many, many others. So plutonium's nasty, but there's something nastier, and that's americium-241, which is a decay product, I think, of plutonium-241, which has a fairly short half-life. So americium-241 is a potent gamma emitter as well as an alpha emitter, and they're extremely worried in Europe because 40% of Europe is contaminated with fallout from Chernobyl and will remain so for hundreds of years. But the americium is now starting to build up as the plutonium-241 decays, and it's very, very toxic and radioactive. So things are going to get worse in Europe over time, not better. And that's described vividly in the book on Chernobyl by the New York Academy of Sciences.
Wow, Helen, I don't know how you go to sleep at night.
Well, I go to sleep by doing this work, which makes me feel more comfortable and that I might make a difference. But in truth, Arnie, we're not making a lot of difference, are we?
I think we are in Japan. I think the Japanese are listening to people like you and the people that went to the symposium more and more and listening to their own government and Tokyo Electric less and less.
Yeah, but you know that I just woke up this morning reading more about Fukushima. It's an absolute mess. A total disaster mess. And they'll never clean it up, never. I mean, the IAEA says it'll take 50 years, 40 or 50 years, but they'll never clean it up. Let's be frank, they won't. It's an unmitigated disaster which will remain in perpetuity for the rest of time. And although the Japanese may become more and more aware of their situation, there's nothing anyone can do about it. You know, human beings can't cope with such an atomic nuclear accident.
You know, I talked about the recovery of Fukushima Daiichi when I was over in Japan at the end of August. And I was at the Independent Press Association, and the video's up on the site. But the recovery of the site will go nowhere as long as Tokyo Electric is in charge. The solution to begin improving the condition of the site is to get Tokyo Electric out of the management of the cleanup and put a competent engineering organization reporting right to Japan, the nation of Japan, being funded by the nation of Japan and being overseen by independent experts as opposed to the closed little club that Tokyo Electric likes to keep the site. Until we do that, that site is going to continue to have leaks and rats eating wires and on and on and on. We've got to get TEPCO out of the picture if we ever expect to make improvements.
And think of the number of people. There are 3,000 men there all the time, I think. And they bring homeless men in from Tokyo, Yakuza, who are the Japanese mafia, subcontracted to provide a lot of the workers. How many people are going to die, being exposed to very high levels of radiation externally, but also inhaling and ingesting radioactive materials? I mean, the thing is just a medical disaster beyond compare.
Dr. Caldicott, thanks for coming on the show.
That's a pleasure.
And Arnie, as always.
Thanks again, Kevin.
Well, that about does it for this week's edition of the Energy Education Podcast. You can catch us back here next Wednesday and every Wednesday for more on what's happening in the world of nuclear news and more technical nuclear discussion. Also, don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For Fairewinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.